Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Mark Cassidy, and I've been part of the group for about 6 months, I think. Jim Burt helped me get involved with the group, and it's been great to see the back and forth and the discussions. And when Michael Strickland posted something a couple of weeks ago about technology roadmaps, I was like, sign me up. I'll talk about that. I've had a couple opportunities to do technology road mapping within a larger organization across functional areas, and also within an ERP, where that's kind of my specialty around ERP. So I just thought I would share some of the ideas that I've used, and I've worked with some of the larger consulting firms on these, as well as doing stuff at a smaller level on my own, like through an ERP group. So so just to kind of preface the discussion, I took Michael's email, and I looked at some of the things he was trying to accomplish. And so, understanding the application ecosystem and implementing new technologies, kind of building out a roadmap for different capabilities, and then trying to gather a lot of information like master data, different master data types, metrics, and ownership, and things like that. So to preface the discussion, and thanks for letting me kind of just get through all the slides first, and then we can have a discussion, because everybody works at a different type of organizations. Organizations are at different levels of maturity. Some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, you're going to be like, forget it. We're not using that stuff. That doesn't make any sense for us. And that's perfectly fine. Other things you may say, hey, we didn't think about that, so let's take our own version of that. And that's really the purpose of this. It's not to tell anybody really how to do anything. It's just to share some ideas on things you might want to think about as you're building your roadmap. So I hope that makes sense. This is kind of an outline for what we're going to talk about. So I really want to emphasize the importance of strong governance and appropriate representation from all your business stakeholders. Understanding and getting alignment from senior leaders on what they want. Of course, as we all know, that changes on a sometimes hourly basis. So if you can get them to speak it out and write it down and get them to look at it, then that always helps. Obviously, you need to gather business requirements. We'll talk about some of the information you might want to gather around that. And obviously thinking about the type of technology you want to use, coming up with some way to score projects, and then put them into some relevant grouping of project, program, initiative. One of the things that I learned in the process is understanding the need to take out kind of run activities. Some companies have a run budget. Other companies kind of group everything into a project budget. So it might be worth considering how those integrate or work together or constrain each other. We'll talk about other constraints too. And also, excuse me, estimations, because all these projects have to be estimated, just so that you have a way of sequencing them through your timeline. And then what do you do next? Where does this stuff go? Who takes it over? And how can you build that into a longer term enterprise strategy? So let me just stop there for a minute. Christine, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, let's rock and roll through this. So governance, right? Everybody's had to work with governance. Everybody's had to deal with groups that have to make decisions, right? So what I found is when you're building a roadmap, if you have or create a steering committee that can help with the decision makings as you go through this process, it's going to really help you along the way. Because number one, you invite them to be part of that decision making process, and then they actually pass that down through the organizations to make sure you get participation, which you'll need as you go through the process. It's also important to get their initial input on prioritization. Now, this could be a company strategic map. It could be some strategic information that the company's driving towards. But ultimately getting that buy-in from governance to make sure that as you go through the process, if you have any changes to your cost schedule, any other changes within the business or business priority, that gets incorporated into the overall. When I did a large transformation recently, we didn't really, ironically, we didn't really have like strategic goals by function. So we used the steering committee to provide kind of a capability theme. And these came out through interviews. We sat down with each of the leaders for the functional areas, and we said, okay, what are the things that are most concerning to the business, where you have the biggest challenges? What are the areas that you need to be proficient in the next 3 to 5 years that you're currently not? And so if you look, here's some examples. Business process automation and workflow was the #1 theme that business owners and business leaders were trying to get, that they saw was a hindrance in their current process. Data asset management, collaboration, knowledge and document management. These types of things are not uncommon in many organizations. The top 10 themes, we gave them a score of 3. We're going to try to use them later for ranking. The rest got a 1. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we use those for scoring. But they also can provide additional weights as you go through the process. Business requirements, we've all been there. You never get all that you need. You never get them in the right format. But if you start off with something that you can go to the business once and get everything, that's going to really help you. It also helps getting the bottoms up, because the people that are working in the organization, the people with their hands on, the people that are doing the day-to-day, they're the ones that really understand what's needed in order to get the organization to the next level. So making sure that you have an opportunity to sit down with those people that are managing the day-to-day, those are the ones that are going to help you get the best requirements. We used, in this example, some other weights like business risk, compliance risk. You can use ROI or time to revenue or whatever other competitive capability. But if you can gather those as part of your business requirements, you can use them later and you don't have to go back to the business because you've already received that input from them. As I mentioned before, we added capability theme also to our collection here of information. So as we gathered a requirement, we tagged it with a capability theme. Like I said, you can use strategic priority. And then we also gathered the business function, the process name, because that's going to help us later as we look at the larger organization and build out a capability map for the whole company. Technology enablers is a great way to look at your organization and understand who needs what. As we went through and looked at the requirements, we tried to tag them with a technology enabler so that we could also group them by technology enablers. Not as easy to say on Friday as you might think. It's not a product. It's not specific. It's not Viva or Sugar CRM. It's a high-level capability that meets the need of the business. So knowledge management, content management, advanced analytics, learning management. When we looked at the organization that I worked with, we had 13 different learning management systems in the company. So you can imagine how difficult that was to maintain, to train. People moved from different groups and had to relearn things again. But one of the things that was really fascinating about this, gathering all this information and understanding what the company needed from a technology perspective, it gave you a chance to see how many people needed the same thing. So instead of implementing, 7 or 8 different business process automation tools, you could implement 1 or maybe 2. So what you have here is the functional areas of the business on the top, but then by program, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different groups who need this, and about 10 different capabilities that are going to be met by a business process automation tool. Again, look at governance and quality. Look at all the people that need these specific capabilities. Collaboration platform, pretty much everybody. Enterprise information integration was another big one. Knowledge management. How do we take all the stuff that's in our emails and get it into the right place? There's a lot of really cool tools that can do that now. But understanding which areas and which capabilities need to be reviewed and utilized for those tools is really important. Which functions need to be just included in the discussion of what's really required from a tool perspective. As Michael pointed out in his original request and discussion around this, master data management is huge in most organizations, and data management is also data domain definitions, huge. This was also huge in the example that I have here. As I mentioned, also learning management. Everybody's organization needs learning. So this was a great way to look at the organization and say, wow, if we just implemented these 5 tools, we could hit 30% of the requirements and probably 90% of the functions would get a benefit from it. So just one other option for you. The weights, we gathered some of these in the business requirements process. In my example, I used compliance risk and business risk, but like I said, whatever is important to your organization is what you need to determine and then capture. The fun part comes when you have to figure out how to really communicate to the business how to score these, because if people realize that compliance risk, high compliance risk is going to get a higher score than something with low compliance risk, they're more likely to give it a higher score on the business requirements. So you need to have some guidelines around what represents high, medium, or low. And that's how we gathered. It was just basically t-shirt size, high, medium, or low risk, or other prioritization for your weights. Again, the governance is really important to make sure that your senior leaders on the steering committee have agreed and they sign off on the weightings that's been provided by the business. And then we can use that to roll them up into programs and projects and initiatives. In my example, we had compliance risk, business risk, and then we used the capability themes down here to also provide a score. In this particular project or requirement, we had a theme that was number 6, so that gets 3 points. We had a compliance impact, which was high, so that was 3 points. Over here, I built out a little table for each of my compliance and risk. So it doesn't have to be anything using calculus or anything very complicated. Something simple like that is fine. You get your attribute score, and then the steering committee again weighs in and says, okay, we captured capability theme, we captured compliance risk and business risk. What's the relative level of importance for each of those in the whole? And so basically they rated their theme as highest, and then compliance and business risk got an equal weighting. So there's your 100%. So the score for this particular requirement was 2.7. And then as you see, all the requirements get a scoring like this, 2.7. So what you come up with is you get all the requirements have been weighted and scored. You get kind of a score for each one. And that's the baseline. Obviously, that's not going to tell you which things to do first or second or last, but it's a good way to start the discussion with your senior leadership. Because now, if you were to plot all these, and I'll show you an example, if you were to plot all of these on a 3-year roadmap, which is what we did in this example, then you can kind of get to see what stuff's going to have to go first, what stuff's kind of in the middle, and what stuff we can put off until later. And really, that's all you're trying to do in this phase when you take this pass. So we've grouped, at this point, we'll take those scores. We've also done another thing. We've looked at the requirements, we've grouped them into initiatives. Some companies will use a portfolio, for example. And within each of those initiatives, then they can be grouped into programs and projects. The example that I wanted to share with you is something like this. So you've got a whole bunch of requirements. You've got scores on them at this point, and you got some scoring information. Then you've got, you've established your initiatives or portfolios. In this example, stabilize and prepare for growth was one initiative. Business efficiency, scaling up the core capabilities of the organization, that was another initiative. And improve data-driven decision-making, okay? So if you could take all your requirements, and this is only 3, maybe you have 5 or 10, figure out from your organization's perspective, what's key to, maybe there's a go-to-market strategy in there, or a time-to-revenue strategy in there, or, depending upon what your organization is focused on, you could have, different initiatives, obviously. So grouping requirements into those initiatives then tells you how those specific requirements are going to help you get to that specific objective, that initiative. And then from there, you can group into programs and projects. Now, this is just one way to do it. Maybe in your organization, you don't have a specific initiative plan. You may have portfolios. You may have an R&D portfolio. You may have a customer go-to-market strategy portfolio. You may have a finance and maybe there's a G&A build the core portfolio. So it just depends on what your organization needs, but by grouping these in such a way, you can build out the projects and programs that are key to meeting those key business objectives. And this is just an example. For your roadmap, these show 3 different initiatives. You've got 6 programs, 2 under each, and a couple of projects under each program. The reason I show this is because the initiatives are something that are very large scale. They could be multi-year, cross-functional efforts. When you group those requirements, the requirements are more like projects. Sometimes you can group the requirements together to be a single project across multiple functions, but a program is really the kind of the next level down from that. So really, you can decide if you want to have both projects and programs. You just have to look at the details and find out what makes the most sense for for the next level of roll-up. So I've just put some examples here. So you've got initiatives, programs, and projects. You've got some scoring based on those. You have an opportunity now to basically put these in a sequence. And the sequence and grouping in such a way kind of gives you that high-level perspective where you can share with the steering committee and then step back and say, are we going in the right direction? Does this make sense? Are these the right priorities? Are these the right initiatives? And this is great because this gives them a high enough picture that they can really look at and talk about how it impacts their organization, and start looking at how it's going to impact not only their own organization, but cross-functionally. So this is an example. In this particular example, we have program portfolios. Okay, so there's an analytics and data management, customer engagement, foundational IT. We found out too in this organization that foundational IT, their projects were getting compared against other business projects and were losing the fight and getting budget money to just get the basics done. So what this also shows you, and this is a good discussion to have, just within IT before you get into the business discussion, because you may realize that some of these capabilities are not even possible without certain baseline structures within the organization. If you don't have a cloud strategy, or if you have an on-prem strategy and a cloud strategy, you need to figure out what direction you're going. What are some of those decisions that need to be made before some of these other platform decisions need to be, can be really put into action. So there's another layer of looking at this from a what can we do now and what's possible and what's not possible. You can see on this, you've got like for each of these programs, you've got scoring. Those come right from your requirements gathering sheet where you capture that information and you gave them those weighted scores based on the steering committee input. Now you've got this great roadmap, but can you really do all that stuff? No bloody way. Obviously, you've got to have some constraints on that thing. It's nice to be able to do the first part of this exercise without introducing constraints so that you get everybody's input. But then you got to put some constraints. Number one, you've got to estimate the projects. And if you remember back to our requirement slide, you had about 1 or 2 sentences for each requirement. Hopefully you get a few more than that. But you won't be able to do much of an estimation of the efforts beyond a rough order of magnitude. Now, that could be different depending upon your organization. You may get a much more detailed and fewer requirements from the business, and that order of magnitude can go much more narrowly. What I mean by rough order of magnitude is if you estimated $1 million for the project, it could actually go to 1.4 million, or it could be as little as 0.6 million. So you have to figure out what makes sense for your organization and what makes sense for your next steps too. So right then, that gives you a funding or a budget constraint. You may also have resource availability or capabilities constraints. If you're moving to more of an area where you're supporting applications, you need to have people that can support those. If you're moving more to a cloud-based, you need to make sure that you've got the right people who can understand how to maintain those tools and capabilities. There may be cross-functional trade-offs. For example, you know, the list I showed you with all the functions that need content management or training management. Some people might need it now, some people might not need it right away. So it might make sense to look at those groups that need it now, but include those that need it later to make sure that you're going down the right path for a future capability that will meet everybody's needs. And it may not. You may have to pick 2 content management systems, or maybe you have 4 training management systems in the organization. But that's the discussion. Some other constraints here. You may have some stuff that's already in process. You may have some big projects that are underway that you can't just stop them in order to do some of these other projects. So some of these new things may have to wait. What we did in one company was we actually put a group of people who were in charge of maintaining all the projects and programs, and they had a portfolio management tool that they used to track all those so that there was some structure and organization going forward and a process. How do we refresh this every year? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But you may come up with something that looks like a multi-year roadmap driven by your initiatives or your portfolios, which shows your different projects and programs grouped in that way. This is a nice way to show it to a lot of the senior leaders because they want to see things in big chunks and they want to see the value in each chunk. So this is a great way to bring it up to a level to show, senior leaders or executive team members. And the steering committee likes this too because they can see where they have projects in each of these areas, and it needs to ring true for them that they really need to stabilize these certain systems before they can really scale up in these areas, and that's going to get them that long-term data decision-making capabilities. Again, just a suggestion. You guys will come up with your own ways of breaking these out and sharing them. One of the things that came out of the discussions as we got through the larger roadmap initiative that I worked on was, how do we keep this thing going forward? Obviously, you need a process. And that's why the roadmap management team came in really handy. We also need people in the organization who can help to kind of refresh this thing on a regular basis. We put into place a process that, number one, we had an annual roadmap refresh process. It aligned with the budgeting process so that when the roadmap initiatives were being requested, they would go into that budget discussion, and then the budget would be constrained enough to be able to weed out some of those and gave you at the end of the list the annual roadmap activities for the following year. And there's a lot of discussion around that. Depending upon, the maturity and the size of your organization, it could be an easier discussion or a more complex discussion, especially the way things are changing right now. There's a lot of other risks and, concerns you might want to take into consideration. Okay, I'm almost done. How are we doing on time? I didn't want to throw all this out there and then not at least give you an idea or way to, or thought about how to maintain it. And I'm just going to give you one example of something that I've used in the past. Generally speaking, it's not for companies that are not mature enough to be able to understand and appreciate the importance and why it's necessary to take all that information to be able to use it going forward. Some organizations are going to be much smaller. They're going to be much more reactive. They're going to have to be able to take this, but then utilize it in a different fashion. This is just one example. We used an enterprise capability modeling tool. What this is it basically looks at the whole entity and then drills down each into the functions, to the processes, and within understanding the capabilities of the organization, helps to capture the capabilities of the departments and the functional areas, the processes. It also can support the capture and linkage of the business objectives to those processes and capabilities. It can then further list out projects, programs, and initiatives, and then the technology systems that support those processes and the infrastructure, and then underneath that, master data, source of record, and ownership. There are tools like that. I'm sure you guys have used some, and I was really excited to work with one. I think we actually use Mega, but I'm sure there's a lot of other tools out there now. We realized as we got through the technology roadmap project that we needed to have a framework to kind of set this on. And the enterprise capability map, I just have an example here, provides levels 1, 2, and 3 of an organization. So level 1 is set strategy, and this is a generic pharmaceutical. So discover and develop drug, make and supply drug, market and sell drug. You also have managing the business and supporting the business. So that's level 1. Underneath that, you have the functional areas like corporate. You have functional areas within the organizations. You have commercial, you have global planning, global production, distribution. On the discover side, you've got drug discovery and development, clinical trials, things like that. On the managed business side, you guys all have these. You've got the marketing and managing capital. You've got all the finance and human resource functions, and then the IT functions down here. And within each of those listed, just some of the key process areas. This is level 3. Excuse me. So for example, managed CMO, part of the global planning organization, that's their level 3. And each of these boxes, the lighter shaded boxes, level 3. This helps to provide a framework for your processes, your key objectives of your business, and then down a level below that. So as I show here, like objectives and goals, you can capture. You capture it by you can also capture the processes and organizations under your capability levels 1, 2, and 3. Underneath that, you can show processes, which show the systems and the data that's part of those processes and what technology supports those. So for example, you can identify your key objectives, KPIs. You can even track projects. Sometimes that's done in a separate system, but you can track your business processes. This particular tool actually let you do diagramming, like a Visio diagramming tool, showed workflows, and from there, it would let you drill down to the sources of record, into the master data, the ownership, and then the infrastructure components, the schemas, and patterns of organization of structure. Now, this will be vastly different for every company because of the way things are moving these days. But one of the things I liked about this is it gave you that high-level framework and then let you drill down to the processes, to the technology, and it let you connect Word documents or websites or Excel spreadsheets or other reports. So it also had an external component as well. So if you wanted to capture all your stuff or you had stuff in a Visio diagram. If it wasn't part of this, you could link it that way. Or if you had the diagrams, the process diagrams here, you could have SOPs linked into, you know, another repository where those were held and maintained. So basically, it just provides a collaborative environment where a lot of information can be stored in the same repository, which is not always the best. It's an option. You may have other ways of managing this too, but it's one way to standardize kind of the output so that you can look at the organization in a similar fashion across different functional areas. So that's all I have. Just wanted to kind of share some ideas. I'd love to get your thoughts, any questions that you have. There's lots of pitfalls, as I'm sure you can see through the process. But I mean, it's a great opportunity to learn about your organization, what's important, and how you can be part of executing against those key objectives of the organization. So, Christine, did you get any questions?
So we've got some comments like,
Okay.
thanks for organizing it, Mark, for sharing it. It's very helpful and informative. So you did a good job.
Okay.
But
Great.
yeah, anybody have comments or questions about this or want to share your own experiences?
Yeah, that'd be great to hear someone else's experience in, you know, in a particular industry or, you know, company. Every company is different.
William, you've reacted with a yes. I don't know if that's the same as raising your hand. But
that was a yes being present. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Okay, we've got
Cool.
a question from Allison. She asked, what are the different mapping tools you suggest?
Process mapping tools, capability mapping. The capability mapping tool that we used was called MEGA, M-E-G-A, but there are many capability modeling tools. If you just look online, I looked up a few the other day, and they all have pretty much the same type of information, but stored in different ways or different formats, or they have different ways of organizing them. From a process modeling perspective, you know, Visio has always been kind of the go-to. There are a lot of other tools, though, that will let you do process mapping. Mega actually had a module that would allow process mapping and then linking to a lot of other stuff which is in the system, which was nice. But you can also do it through Visio or you know, other tools. Does that answer your question?
Okay, we've got another one. What are some of the common pitfalls to avoid in this process? Also, if you had to do this again, what would you do differently?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of pitfalls along the way, and I think from historical perspective, making sure you have the right people at the table on your steering committee is one really important thing. They have to be very active in their organizations and also active managing up to their hierarchies as well. And people who are enthusiastic and want to participate, you'll get the most and best quality input from those type of leaders. So make sure you pick your steering committee well. The other thing is you need to make sure that, you know, I think we had some challenges with making decisions around weightings or making decisions around, you know, the things that were strategic objectives. We need to always run those through our steering committee to hold them accountable for the decisions that were made on those. So make sure you're always using the steering committee to not only check the box and prove what you've got so far, but also suggesting to them, here are the things we need to decide in the next step. What are your thoughts? And then gather the information, present it back to them, make sure that they then vote or score or agree. If you can get everybody to agree, awesome. Doesn't always happen. But making sure that your steering committee is helping you along the way, because If they're not fully invested in the project, you'll have problems getting the right requirements. You'll have problems getting, getting them to buy in on the process. I think one of the mistakes we made early on in the project was not getting the IT organization involved, because they had their own, objectives and challenges that needed to be included in this process as a functional organization of the company. So make sure you always include IT as well as a seat at the table in the process. What else? Communication. Geez, you can't over communicate in a program like this. You need to let people know where they're going next, and out of those decisions, let the business people know that level below you, the level below the steering committee. Here's the decisions that were made. Here's what it means, and here's what we're going to do next. I found in several different organizations that I've worked for, you can share information with the steering committee or senior leadership, but they don't always push it down to the organization on their own. So helping to create that transparency for your senior leaders to be able to deliver a message, making it easier for them to deliver that message, and holding them accountable for that message, make sure that the whole organization kind of travels together as a group, and that's really important. If I had to do it again, I'd love to do it again, actually. It's such a fascinating, it's such a fascinating activity. I mean, working to understand where an organization goes, what are the things that are going to have to get us there, what are the key processes that support those key objectives, and the systems and the technology that's going to help us get there the fastest. And like I said, one of the favorite things that I had, the aha moment, was when I looked across all the functions and I saw, oh my God, not only do we have 13 different learning management systems in the company, but we probably need a learning management capability for 13 different organizations. Maybe we just don't need 13. But having the visibility to what the organization needs by capability or by tool set, that's so powerful. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Mark, we've got many more now. So
Okay.
I just want to remind everyone, if you guys also have answers to these questions, or you want to chime in after Mark finishes, like just put in the chat, I can share on this or something like that, and I will unmute you. But it's just so Mark can have a break, he's probably thirsty by now.
Oh, that's okay. I have some water, so just let's go for it. But you can unmute people too if they wanna be part of the discussion. So raise your hand.
Okay, so this one's from our friend Jim. He says, how did you organize so that decisions stuck and organizations did not do end arounds to their executives or the CFO/CEO for funding?
Ah, boy, that's the age-old question, Jim. I think again it goes back to the buy-in and the transparency, because when you get your senior leaders to agree this is how we're going to do it, and they participate to provide the requirements and the prioritization around that, and then you share it with everybody. If you see somebody going around the corner, obviously the functional areas have their own budgets. They may just jump off and go do something on their own. If you bring that visibility back to the steering committee, then you can put somebody at the table in the steering committee on the spot for going around the process. And we had that same issue as we went through this, and it's a constant monitoring, and it's holding the steering committee accountable for not only the decisions that they make, but the activities that they're doing on the side. So yeah, tough question. Good question though.
Okay. We have, how frequently the roadmap reevaluation/revision should be done. So how frequently should the roadmap reevaluation or revision be done, considering the business environment today?
Yeah, good question. In this example, this was a technology roadmap for a whole company of 10,000 people. So we kept roadmap projects specifically to the roadmap. As I mentioned, some of the slides, if you have a run budget or you have other run dollars that you need to have, for example, for ERP, we had some run dollars that we had to have every year. we prioritized those separately. We had our own roadmaps for those. The larger roadmap was more of an annual process because it aligned with the annual budget. And I think from a corporate-wide perspective, you need to consider having an annual budgeting process. At the same time, like I said, the ERP level projects, we had the dollars that we would get as part of the run budget every year. And then we did a separate process where we had a quarterly intake for requirements and business needs. And then we just did a rolling delivery model so that we would crank them out as soon as we finished one, then we could start the next one. So there's different ways of doing it, but you need to look at what your objectives are and what the environment will allow. Sometimes you just have to move faster. You can't do it on an annual basis. Maybe you have to do a quarterly.
So Abhijan, I know you asked that question. Do you want to respond at all, or good?
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. So our next question is, what kind of timeline is this on? What if we want shorter roadmaps and our business priorities or requirements change frequently? So a little bit similar.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question because every company is going to be a little bit different. You may find that your initiatives are, we got to get this done today or the business is going to seriously be impacted. So those are the things you're going to focus on first. You can start that initiative while you're building out the next initiatives. So for example, in that case, maybe you could build that whole thing out in 3 to 6 months or even less. And then as soon as that's done, you get back at the table and you say, okay, we've got these initiatives underway. We're building out the infrastructure that we need to be able to get these new capabilities, which we're going to need to be competitive. And now we're going to go to step 2. This is the stuff that's going to help us be more competitive against our, in the market. So, and this is the next initiatives. And maybe you've gathered a lot of this information, or you do it as you go through the process. That's a great question, because I think more and more entities are going to have to be able to kind of build their own process like this that meets their business needs, and it's not one size fits all by a long stretch. I hope I answered your question.
What did you already say this? What timeline you actually did do it at?
This program, this initiative took about 18 months. And at the end of 18 months, we had an unconstrained roadmap, and it took us another 4 to 5 months to constrain it. That's where everything started to get squeezed, and then things started popping out of the sides, like Jim had mentioned earlier. How do you stop the business? Oh, well, my project didn't get prioritized for starting next year, so I'm just going to do it anyway. You gotta get those people out in the open, and some of that's just going to happen anyway. So it'll be different for everybody, but yeah, that's how it goes.
Okay, and our last question is from Jack, and sorry if I say this wrong. Oh, we've got another one actually, but was TOGAF, the TOGAF framework, leveraged and or relevant? If not, why?
I'm not familiar with TOGAF. Can you be more specific? Maybe you can get him, open up the mic.
Yeah, Jack, do you want to say something about it? I don't know what that is either. So I'll wait to hear from Jack, but
TOGAF is an enterprise architecture standard. So I was just curious if there's a link from Amber, thank you, Amber, that explains the framework and talks about some of the models and stuff that you've been doing.
Sure.
Provide the set of templates and so forth. So.
Yeah, just so when we did the technology roadmap itself, we used kind of one philosophy, and then when we realized we had to keep it alive, going forward, we kind of jumped into this capability modeling activity. So we may have used some of the capabilities, or we may have used some of the components of that, but it wasn't necessarily utilized visibly in the direction that we went. But you can certainly use it for what you need. Absolutely. And I would suggest you look at it.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so this is the last question we'll do with Mark so that Teresa can get started. So Teresa, if you want to fire up your slides while we go through this one. But Abhijit asked how to keep track of certain, oops, let me pull it back up. I don't know. Oh. How to keep track of certain business needs not met by a project and ensure they are prioritized in the next cycle.
Yeah, great question. Great question. So you remember we captured all of those business requirements in templates. Once you get to the stage where you're doing estimations, you need a little bit more information. We actually blew those out. So we had like a one-page baseball card for each of the business requirements. Once we get down to the constraining portion, then you realize you're not going to be able to do everything. So you have to let the business tell you what's top priority for them. And it's usually the ones that are the highest scores. Otherwise, they lied to you earlier. So you definitely want to utilize the scoring, but ultimately, a lot of those projects will have to go onto a list. So when we handed this off to the business, we basically handed it off to the business engagement teams within IT who had ownership of supporting a business functional area. And we gave the list to them. And we said, okay, here's the list. These top ones got on the roadmap for this year, but the rest of the list did not. So during the refresh process and in your discussions with the business as you have them throughout the year, but especially at the refresh process, you take that list back to them. You said, okay, last year you told me these were top priorities. What's changed? Let's reorder those. And based on what you've provided in the past, let's see which ones bubble up to the top. And are there new capabilities that you need now that you didn't put on the list last year? Let's look at those as well. So it becomes a repository for going back to the business to start the conversation again, to figure out what needs to be prioritized for the next quarter or the next year or whatever your cycle is. So you definitely want to keep all that stuff and be aware that the priority may change between period 1 and period 2, but you need to use those to remind the business what they asked for. Maybe some of those have changed and maybe there's new stuff and maybe some of that stuff will fall off. So refreshing, that's part of the refresh process.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That was awesome. I already got some emails and other things saying that it was really, really helpful.